So when the people set out from their encampment to cross the Jordan, the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant led them to the water. The Jordan was now at flood stage, for it was harvest time. But no sooner had the priests set their feet in the edge of the river than the water upstream stopped flowing. They piled up for a great distance, as far away as a dam, to the town of Zarephath. The water flowing down to the Sea of Araba, that is the Salt Sea, was completely cut off. And the people crossed over at the spot opposite Jericho. The priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Yahweh stood firm on dry land in the middle of the Jordan until the entire nation had crossed the river. Praise God.
Thanks be to God.
We talked about this a little bit just now with the children, but to orient ourselves a little bit more into where we are in the story right now. Yes, the Israelites have escaped from slavery, and they are nervous about the microphone. We'll try this one. All right. They have they've crossed the Red Sea as it parted. They've wandered in the wilderness for 40 years, and they're at the banks of the Jordan River. And on the other side, they see the Promised Land. So today we're going to explore through the stories of three of our community members, Chloe Halvorson, Doug Brown, and Joe Scheck. What does it mean to finally come home? To come home to ourselves, not only to escape peril, but to come home into safety, into our own liberation, to our true selves. I want to be really clear, though, before we get deeper into this text, that we are not going to treat this text as if it is an assurance of Zionism, right? This is not a text that justifies Israel for the people of God, right? Thinking about what's happening now in Gaza, in Palestine, in Israel, this text does not support that. Lila Watson, an Aboriginal activist, said, "If you've come here to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you have come here because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together." Liberation is for everyone. Put another way, right? Martin Luther King, injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And when one people are oppressed for the sake of another, it's not liberation. So we're holding that in our hearts with us as we explore this text today about what it means to cross the river into our transformation toward our whole, full selves. One last note before I turn the mic over to Chloe is you might ask, what does this story have to do with baptism? Last week, we were with John the Bather, or John the Baptist, as he invited to bathe people in the waters of the Jordan. He invited them out of the halls of power in Jerusalem, out of the communal Roman baths that had been put in place by the Roman Empire, into the wilderness, away from the prying eyes of power, to be washed clean. To be washed clean of our pain, of our complicity. This is a place where Jesus was baptized, and where God first claimed Jesus as their child, beloved and whole before Jesus had done anything but be. So today we celebrate these stories of coming home crossing rivers. And then the storytellers, after they share, will be invited to cross this dry land and to come to the pond and to add their water and their story into our living water of our community.
Good morning, everyone. So when in the email Alison sent asking for speakers, she provided a few sort of questions to get us thinking about what we wanted to talk about and how we wanted to talk about it. One of the questions asked us to think about a time we crossed a threshold of liberation. And that's the story I chose to talk about because in my case, it was a literal threshold. It was into a place called the Beat Collective. It is a radical housing cooperative based in Boulder, Colorado, where I lived from the ages of 18 to 22. And while people there didn't always identify with these labels themselves, the community identified as anarchists. And I want to take a minute, and that's where I learned what that word actually meant, and I want to share that with you. Spoiler alert, it is not what you see in V for Vendetta. It is not a call for violence. It is not a call for destruction. It is certainly not a call to abandon all systems and live in some sort of fend for yourself, fear of your neighbor sort of lifestyle. In practice, anarchism is a call, if anything, of creation, of radical imagination, of asking ourselves, what would the world be like if we were able to take care of each other rather than being forced to cede our power to systems based on control that do not always have our best interests at heart, as we've seen time and time again. And that, I'm so sorry. And in fact, the most devout anarchists I have ever met in my life have been some of the gentlest, most system-oriented people I've ever met. And walking into the space, I got to see what that looked like in action, which as a young teenager, just barely understanding her own agency was a really radical thing. And they putting into practice the question of what does, I'm so sorry. And talking about building strong, resilient communities that are independent from these systems. And so what that looked like was, from an economic standpoint, we were able to divest from the cost of living crisis in Boulder by 12 people, all grown adults from a wide variety of age groups, sharing a 5-bedroom home in order to insulate themselves to that. Included in that rent was a food stipend. There was a whole inter-co-op network that purchased food collectively. And a goal of the community was that nobody who lived there would ever have to go hungry, that everyone would always be able to feed themselves with what the community had, and then if they wanted to bring things on their own, they could. And interpersonally, it really challenged the common conventions of like punitive punishment and incarceration, and through consensus-based decision practices, same as we do for Levin, and through restorative justice-based conflict mediation, centering humanity and relationship as the core of what matters, and not whether or not someone did something right or wrong and how to punish them for it. And in the community, through mutual aid works, we would, we would actually dumpster dive throughout the city, and we would use that food to prepare out on the street for houseless folks in a park every week. And once again, as an idealist, we have these ideals, and they're very easy to intellectually hold on to, but they're so enormous and so daunting that it can seem really difficult to know where to start. And upon crossing that threshold into that space, I got to see that it can be done. And that was, and there was no turning back from that. How can you when you know that there is another way? Thank you.
I grew up poor, and I didn't like it. Often there was not quite enough food for my rapidly growing teenage body, and we were at the mercy of landlords and neighboring tenants, with whom my mother often fought over noise and over roaches. You know, but the material poverty really didn't bother me as much as what I felt was the lack of acceptance by my peers from school. My old clothes didn't fit very well, and I was often taunted with the phrase, "Where's the flood?" People looking at my pants that weren't long enough. And I, in turn, I have to admit, I didn't really fully accept my very style-conscious classmates. I was very interested in learning about the world, and it seemed like they were just very interested in material things. So when I was accepted, this was in Queens, New York, when I was accepted into the Bronx High School of Science, I said to myself, hallelujah, I'm going to the promised land. And high school was indeed a blessing, a heaven compared to the hell of junior high school. But I didn't really find my people or community there. Partly it was because I had a 90-minute commute on the subway each way, so I couldn't really stay very long after school for extracurricular activities. And also I think I was very preoccupied by the suffering of my mentally ill dad and my very stressed out mom. So I wasn't really present to a lot of my classmates. So I was actually shocked when in my senior year I was offered a full scholarship to go to Colgate University, upstate New York. And I said to myself, hallelujah, I'm going to the promised land. And at Colgate, I had my first real encounters with adults whom I could take as role models, and who challenged me academically and spiritually. My cynical New York atheism came up against people who seemed to live a socially conscious as well as a life informed by deep faith. And but my faith was in science, and I couldn't really grok how a belief in God squared with my understanding of how things worked. And eventually my quest to find meaning and a life of service led me to education as a family nurse practitioner at Yale. And I thought, here at last, I would find the promised land. Now, at first working as a nurse practitioner, I was thrilled by my seeming ability to help people out of acute illnesses with antibiotics and steroids and all of the rest that pharmaceuticals have to offer. But over the years, I became more and more disillusioned with what I felt was really my lack of ability to really cure people's chronic illnesses, and also by the failure of the medical model to connect people's social circumstances and what was going on in their emotional and psychic and spiritual lives with the diseases and the symptoms that were manifesting. So about 10 or 11 years into this progressive disillusionment and cynicism, my then 2-year-old son developed a pretty serious infection, an ear infection, but one that didn't respond to the antibiotics I gave him. And it was going on for a long time, and out of desperation, I brought him to a homeopath. And I was shocked and amazed that a medicine which had absolutely no material substance in it rapidly cured him of his illness, when my very sophisticated modern scientific medicine had failed to do a bloody thing. So I went to homeopathic medical school, and I had a conversion experience. I learned that disease does not come from outside of us, but rather from a distorted perception and understanding of who we are. I discovered how to facilitate healing by listening more deeply to my patients and to discern the specific pattern of thought and perception which made them vulnerable to expressing their distress with a particular constellation of emotions and disease symptoms. This hard-won knowledge affirmed an intuition that I had had as a kid, that what we own or what we achieve is not the measure of who we are. It is our capacity to expand our interiority, to make space for the other in our experience of being alive. That this in the end defines our identity and our legacy. The promised land is not out there, somewhere outside of us. It is inside of each of us, waiting to be unveiled by the dissolution of the illusions about ourselves and others that conceal the presence of God within. Just wanted to share a quotation from Eddie Halvorson. Eddie Halvorson was a Dutch Jewish woman who lived at the time of the invasion by the Nazis of Holland. She was a young, intellectual woman, student of Russian, interested in all kinds of things, but the amazing thing that she left us is this diary of her interior life as she dealt with the Nazi brutality. She's really a heroine in that she had the opportunity to flee, but she decided to stay with the community and really minister to them. And she was murdered in Auschwitz. But before she was killed, she wrote this. She says, "But the idea of suffering, which is not the reality, for real suffering is always fruitful and can turn life into a precious thing, must be destroyed. The idea of suffering must be destroyed. And if you destroy the ideas behind which life lies imprisoned as behind bars, then you liberate your true life, its real mainsprings, and then you will also have the strength to bear real suffering, your own and the world's."